This is not a Rickroll. This is a link to the slides and all of the reference talks that I reference in this talk. So if you want to scan that QR code, go ahead. Perl at PayProp. This is a talk I gave at FOSDEM, so I'm doing the Nick thing of wearing an appropriate t-shirt for the talk. It's a short talk about using Perl at a established company. And I'm giving this from the point of view that I gave it at FOSDEM, so the alternative was changing the slides, which I couldn't be bothered to do. So about me, and I don't normally do this, but there's a few faces I don't recognize here. I'm sure a few people don't recognize me either, so it's worth doing. I'm a senior developer and head of processing at PayProp since almost 11 years. I'll get into that shortly. I've been a developer for 20 years. I've only worked for 3 companies in that time, so I've seen tech stacks kind of grow or shrink as appropriate. And I've worked with various languages, but most often Perl. I'm a CPAN contributor, Lijo. London and Swiss Perl workshop organizer. I'll talk about that a bit later. Regular speaker at other Perl workshops and conferences, often helping out with recordings and talks. Thank you. And I occasionally blog about Perl. I prefer to write long form articles rather than short technical talks for various reasons that I won't get into. I run the Perl Events Instagram account. That's pretty much the limit of my social media interaction, so I stay away from most of that shit, to be honest. And I'm a FOSDEM newbie. Well, I was a FOSDEM newbie. Okay, so yeah, about PayProp. Who are we? What do we do? We are a payment and reconciliation platform for the residential lettings industry. Company's been around for 20 years this year. I'll get into that. So what do? We kind of automate things like this and put nice web interfaces on them. Max laughs because he knows exactly what this is. This is one of the nicer ones, I have to say, even though they've still got some 2-digit year in there. Anyway, so we turn that kind of thing into this kind of thing and put interfaces and automation on time-consuming payment flows. So we save customers sometimes literally days, if not weeks, of manual reconciliation work. And the keen-eyed of you, well, maybe those in the front row, given how small it is, will see CGI.pm in that URL. So yeah, we've been around for 20 years. So it's a bit of an understatement to say we have some older code, some legacy code in places. But we don't have a legacy Perl. We're currently on 5.32, hoping to get to 5.38 this year. We tend to trail a major version. We do build our own Perl. We don't do anything special. I mean, in theory, we could compile it with various different flags, but we don't. We don't use a system Perl, however. So we've got control over dependencies, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's not the system Perl. So we're not tied to any particular version of an operating system or packages or whatever. And we can apply security patches as necessary. When I gave this talk in FOSDEM, I think 2 weeks before I gave it, there was a couple of critical CVEs against spreadsheet ParsXL or something. So, we kind of dropped in the fixes as soon as we saw those CVEs being announced, which might take a bit longer if you're using system Perl or whatever. Yeah, it gives dependency control, which is critical, and looser coupling from OS upgrades, and, migration is a bit easier. And it's everywhere. So from dev through to CI, through to staging, through to prod. It's the same version of Perl, same version of the modules, and so on and so forth. Because otherwise you're going to have fun with all that stuff. Debugging, that kind of stuff can be fun when there's differences. So yeah, what are the issues and challenges around that? Well, I'm sure you've heard of these. You still use Perl. What is Perl? We're hearing that more now when we're putting out job specs and stuff. And then the bus factor, or bus factors. So yeah, it's an old app, but it's in the process of modernizing. So we are modernizing. We're moving from CGI.pm to something more fun to work with. It's an ongoing task, about 2/3 complete at the moment. 2/3 in terms of number of requests, because after 20 years we have, I don't know, 250 different pages, but really only 10-20% of those are actually used, because you end up, stuff piles up, features pile up, and then people stop using those features, and then, you know, they just kind of sit there and rot. So we want to kind of not convert those, you know, just throw them away. So we have pages that will never be ported. We'll just switch them off. I'll replace with like the data warehouse or whatever that we're kind of looking at as well. And when we started doing this, originally we were looking at using this plugin for Mojolicious. So you could run CGI requests from Mojolicious, but we decided not to do that with PayProp because we just got Apache in front of it anyway. So it makes it a bit easier if we split stuff to the Mojolicious app at the kind of Apache level rather than faffing around in Mojolicious. I did give a previous talk about this almost a decade ago, so the link is there. A decade ago is a long, long time in terms of Mojolicious because it was moving very quickly at first. So anything in that presentation will be not irrelevant, but examples will be broken and no longer what they are now. Yeah, so the issues and challenges around that. Mojolicious moves quickly. It has slowed down in the last couple of years, and I don't know if that's because the core devs are kind of focusing on the JavaScript version of the framework rather than the Perl version now. They do claim in their documentation that you can always count on backwards compatibility, but they have a 3-month deprecation window where they will actually remove features, and that, sorry, that's not backwards compatibility. It's quite the opposite. And that kind of compounds debugging attempts. So the main pain point we have when we upgrade to a new Perl and we want to upgrade our modules is Mojolicious changes break things. So just keep that in mind. And yeah, the commit messages are very poor. I have to call out Sebastian on this. They're some of the worst commit messages I've ever seen, which makes debugging and, you know, fixing things harder. There it is. So we're adding an ORM, and I know this can be a contentious issue if you read some people's blogs and Hacker News, which I kind of find surprising. I'm tired of writing stuff like this. It's about the simplest use case you can have with DBI. Write some SQL and prepare it with the error handling and execute. I just don't want to do that. I just, you know, prefer being more descriptive. Find a property with this ID, then call some methods on an object. Prefer not to code all of the stuff we get for free. And, you know, if we want to drop down to vanilla SQL, we can still do that. And we do that for some of the hairier reporting queries. You know, it's quite easy to do with the ORM we're using. And the ORM we're using allows us to kind of hide some of the technical debt we have in the schema. So again, 20-year-old application, there's some technical debt there. Some poorly defined relationships, you know, lack of foreign keys, data types not the best, confusing naming. So, you know, maybe we could fix that and maybe things would break, but we don't want to do that. This is what somebody suggested when I said we use an ORM, you know, to hide some of that technical debt. Just fix it and it'll break. It's like, no, we're not going to kind of risk the business just to, you know, satisfy an ideal. And yeah, we could write our own ORM, abstract that into our own logic, but we'd have a half-done ORM. So why do that? You know, somebody has spent the time to write one that's been battle tested, and most of the bugs been ironed out. So we use that one, which is DBIx class. And as I said, it's not dogmatic about its use, so we can drop down to vanilla SQL if we need to. So yeah, some of the issues and challenges around that. Well, a learning curve. There's the ORM has its own domain-specific language which you need to learn. It's currently unmaintained. I think there are discussions going on about what can happen there. I gave a much longer talk about this and about how we're using it in some ways to address the technical debt legacy issues there and how you can use some of its features. So that's the link to the slides. Still relevant because actually DBIx class moves quite slowly. And we're using business objects. We're using OO programming. The older code is kind of a procedural mashup of business logic and database access and all kind of squashed into the same layer. The newer code is factored into business objects. And this is our model. The ORM is not our model. People often conflate the two. We keep them separately. And if you're doing OO properly, you get all of this useful stuff. I won't go through them, but it's really cool stuff. What we're using Moose, and eventually we may use Karina, which was added in 5.38. Obviously, they're iterating on that now, so it's changing a little bit, but you know, they're again taking it slowly and getting it right. And just to give an example of how we might use this in our backend, so we describe an incoming payment as an object, which has a bank statement attribute, which is also another object, and we can use type constraints to say that the bank statement object must be of a bank statement type, and it has to have an ID, and so on and so forth. So we get, you know, type checking. And then we can call methods, you know, tell don't ask principal, say fail this payment, and just delegate to that object to do it, rather than littering all of the logic elsewhere. So yeah, what are the issues and challenges around doing that? Well, again, it's a learning curve. The Moose manuals are very good, but there's a lot there. And I feel like even though I've been using this for a long time, I've only kind of scratched some of the surface of it. There's been multi-day courses at Perl conferences dedicated to Moose, so it's impossible for me to kind of go into any depth here at all. The slow startup isn't as big a deal these days. It depends on how much of the world you need to load. We do use some of this in the CGI scripts, but we tend to lazy load it. And those are longer running requests anyway, so the difference of compiling, you know, this stuff for a request that takes 3 or 4 seconds anyway is minimal. And then mutable state, yeah, that's my technical debt. But we are approaching all new objects are immutable. So refactoring and regression testing, yeah, beyond unit and integration testing. So again, 20-year-old company, there wasn't much test coverage when I arrived. I've been trying to add more and more and more of this. But we have these critical business scripts that have existed forever. And we have a bootstrapping problem in that we want to get them into a state where they're easier to test, but we can't change them because they have no tests. And then, you know, how do you fix that problem? Well, Nick's going to talk about that, so I'm not going to spoil his talk, so I'll skip past these slides. That's a link to Nick's talk, which was in Helsinki last year, but he's going to give it, I think, tomorrow. So.
Yeah, first thing, wake you up.
Yeah. Yeah, and he's going to talk about that, but yeah, it adds more technical data first, and we end up debugging the tests, but yeah, it's all useful stuff, as you will see. So contributing to CPAN, we actively encourage people to contribute to CPAN. So these are all the distributions we've either written or taken over maintenance of in the last decade. That's quite small, don't worry about it. It's stuff like Mojolicious plugins. So I wrote the NYT-prof plugin. I wrote a couple of OAuth 2 server plugins, which I'm hoping to change to adopt me, because we're throwing that all away to use Cognito on AWS, which would be great, because if you've ever used OAuth 2, you know it's interesting, to say the least. But these, I thrashed through these about 6 years ago, and they just work and people are using them, and I've had very few bugs raised against them, which is good. And we do interact with other payment service providers, and one of the problems obviously with this Perl is the newer APIs tend to lack distributions to interact with them, but most APIs these days are RESTful and JSON, so you can knock together a distribution in a couple of days, if not a week, if it's more complex. Business TrueLayer is one I wrote last, I think it was October or November, so they threw me at it for a week, and there's something on CPAN now. And we do other stuff like we maintain CGI.pm because, you know, business is still built on CGI.pm. And we fork and update existing libraries if they've fallen out of maintenance. So yeah, the issues and challenges there, well, as we all know, the pool of contributors to CPAN is shrinking. And as I said, libraries for newer services and APIs don't often exist. And yeah, navigating around IP issues. This is actually quite a good one because it encourages to properly decouple our business logic from, say, speaking to that API. So doing it that way is actually quite a good thing. Julian's talked about this a little bit. We hire devs new to Perl. And it's been on the plateau of productivity for a while, I think. Those that left it a long time don't know the current ecosystem. They've still got this idea that it hasn't moved on in 20, 25 years. You know, like as soon as they moved to their new favorite language, Perl stagnated, which was maybe the case for a couple of years, but actually no. And we're more than a generation removed from Perl 5. You know, Perl 1 was released 37 years ago, Perl 5 30 years ago, 5.10 17 years ago. There's people starting university who were born after 5.10 was released. But it's still in a lot of places. We know this through interviewing people, and some people that can't talk about where they're using it. They can't sponsor conferences, they can't say what they're doing because their company won't let them talk about it. I think its popularity has kind of normalized over the last 2 decades. If you look at certain indexes, you'll see all languages trending towards a homogenized state in terms of popularity. You might have a couple of big ones, but the rest are doing that. And Perl is no different. So it's hard to find Perl developers, but I find that newcomers don't have preconceptions. It's kind of my experience of interviewing. You know, generally those under 30 either haven't heard of the language or they haven't used it. And those who don't want to use language self-select out of the hiring process anyway, because we are explicit in job specs that we use Perl. We don't list it as a requirement unless we're asking for a senior Perl developer, but we say we use Perl. And I think modern Perl is an interesting and enjoyable language to work with. And working with legacy code is a reality. That's no way unique to Perl. It's not the only problem, you know, that Perl has. And we do all of this stuff. And you should be doing all of this stuff. It's essential if you have newcomers to the language, especially for Perl, because the web is full of a lot of bad and out-of-date advice. Such is the nature of a language that was very popular 25 years ago. I blogged about this a little bit. I haven't really talked about it previously, but I have a few long-form blog posts where I touch on it. And I think the point here is that you can be very experienced but still a newcomer, and that's absolutely fine. And I think it's actually beneficial to the ecosystem and the community. So speak up. We want to hear from you. Any questions? Nick?
So companies using Perl, who's on a Mac? Do head on user bin F user. It's a post-specified thing. It's be there.
Yeah. So one of the things I didn't mention there is I gave this talk at FOSDEM. I still got a couple of minutes left, I think. And their video setup is incredible. They live stream over almost 1,000 talks over the space of the weekend, and they are uploaded. So they're annotated, cut, trimmed, edited, uploaded pretty much immediately. And every single video goes through a modern Perl application. So whenever they send an email to the speaker, can you please review this talk? That's a Mojolicious app that was written in the last, I think, 3 or 4 years. So yeah, it's out there. Okay, thanks everybody.